talofalawa, malo lei nisa bolavanaka, rana lem, whakalofa lahi atu, whakaawe lahi, and welcome everyone to the closing panel for day 2 of PIPSA. I'm very honoured and privileged to be chairing this amazing session with young Pacific scholars from the region. So the panel will be in 2 parts. We'll talk firstly about, I guess, the hot topics and key areas for the contemporary Pacific as scholars from the region identify them. And then the second part, we'll be looking at reflections from the 2-day conference and what were some of the key themes or topics that were missing from this conference to help inform further PIPSA conferences. So I'd like to introduce our panel. First we have GJ Millie, who is an academic from the University of Hawaii. She is currently with the Political Science Department at the University of Papua New Guinea. She is an activist and a Pacific feminist, and she's also very active in civil society. She is currently the president of the 2 Mile Women's Empowerment and Social Development Association. We've also got Elvira Rumkabu from Sendawashi University. She is a lecturer in international relations. In her previous life, she was a news presenter for Papua TV, and she has been the coordinator for Independent Research Community, Solidarity of Indigenous People, and We Rise Coalition, a feminist Pacific coalition. We also have William Wangavakatonga, who is a Master of Arts student at the University of the South Pacific. He too is a former journalist and is currently a teaching assistant in the Human Rights Program at the University of the South Pacific. And finally, we have Michael Kabuni, who is a lecturer in politics at the University of Papua New Guinea. He is a graduate of Korea University and has written and published extensively on party politics in Papua New Guinea. All right, so I think the leading ladies will start first and talk about what do you think are the contemporary issues that are affecting the Pacific region today?
Thank you, Ronnie, for the introductions. I have, I think, two points that I would, from my observation, mostly from Papua New Guinea and in the region, which I feel like affect the Pacific community. Firstly is the representation of women in politics. It's a big issue. We have very low representation of women in a lot of the governments around the Pacific. And I feel like maybe some kind of actions have to be taken in order to address that. In Papua New Guinea at the moment, we have no women parliamentarian or politician. We had the limited preferential voting system introduced, and that kind of helped women in being represented. But in the 2017 election, that obviously didn't happen. So I feel like maybe issues, maybe actions like introducing a quota system would be very helpful in addressing that issue. Secondly, I'd like to, I feel like gender-based violence is also an issue that women in the Pacific face a lot. In Papua New Guinea, we have issues like sorcery accusation, related violence, which is very prevalent. Also, well, just domestic violence and just general gender-based violence is an issue. And I feel like those 2 issues in terms of gender should be or could be looked more at.
Thank you.
Yes. Thank you. For me, one of the biggest issues, I come from West Papua, so one of the biggest issues I think is when we talk or we are picturing what the regional Pacific regionalisms look like, and by talking about the regional Pacific, Pacific regionalism, I kept thinking about when there are competing values and issues where, for instance, when we talk about decolonization, are we really put the decolonization agenda on when we are thinking about this framework of Pacific regionalism? Because what I can see now that issues of decolonization, like we're discussing in several days, that's why the conference here, decolonization matters, but when we talk on the regional, bring it and think about the Pacific collective stance on the decolonizations, I think I don't know how to imagine what would be the regional initiative look like on the decolonization issues. I'm taking the issue of West Papua, for instance, like until now, for me, I cannot see that there is a collective political stance on West Papuan issues. When on one side, Pacific have these values of Melanesian solidarity, Melanesian brotherhood, and we believe with the spirit of decolonization that every country has to be freed. But on the other side, the reality is that we need, in the Pacific, need economic benefits, economic independence. I think we are dependent on country like Indonesia now, one of the important actor in the Pacific because of West Papua. So what I can see is there are competing values between Melanesian solidarity on the one side, and then the other side is a material benefit or real politics and talking about the economic benefits and etc. So because of this, I always asking if I meet some Pacific leaders, I will ask them, what is the regional initiative on the West Papuan issues? What would the regional initiative look like on touching on West Papuan issues? Because for us, West Papuan always believe that we can push our issue in the Pacific because we believe in the ideas of this Melanesian solidarity. But yeah, on the level of the regional position, I think it's still a big question. The colonization, human rights issues matters, but how can we really take a real actions, especially collective possession? I think that's one of the biggest issues that I can think of.
Nisa Bolivnaka, and good evening. I look at the panel and I'm thinking that we're all millennials here at this point in time. So I'm going to start off by talking about a tweet that I saw 1 week before I came to New Caledonia. And the tweet is actually from a senior lecturer who tweets a lot, Anna Pauls from Massey University. And it struck me before I came to this event how it resonated with me personally. And I quote the tweet. Yesterday, I declined to be on a panel on Pacific security issues because the federal panelists were all non-Pacific Islanders. This perpetuates the privilege of ideas. I suggested they come back to me if they achieve panel parity. This is the Pacific version of MANO. The reason why that particular tweet resonates with me because it's an indication that there are people that are genuinely wanting to engage with the Pacific in going forward with understanding the Pacific. Earlier on, the Director General talked about history of the Pacific has been of benign neglect and who drives the agenda. In many instances for upcoming potential or aspiring academics, we sometimes feel that we are not being nurtured to be able to master our own destiny. And so I find that the University of New Caledonia and ANU providing this space to listen to us, to allow us to be part and to share our experiences, but not only that, but to learn from well-established people, senior academics and professors. It helps the narrative that Pacific Island countries would like to master their own destiny. But it is indeed a privilege that for this events like this allow that opportunity and space to take place. But that does not always happen around the globe. People want to decide what's best for the Pacific without wanting to collaborate first. The Pacific is still young in nature in terms of aspiring academics, people that are trying to do their research, but the onus is on the expertise from the outside region to come and assist us and make us understand better the theories and so forth. And I feel that events like this, they provide that opportunity, which is important going forward. With that being said, coming from the University of the South Pacific background, we've been going through a lot of troubles recently in regards to our space in able to talk and discuss these issues as Pacific Islanders. You may be aware that there's a lot of politics involved with the previous Vice Chancellor and President and the Governor of Fiji and so forth. So opening up this type of spaces provides that opportunity to allow us to broaden our understanding and our thinking of what is not available locally. You do have academics that do come in. We have our own Pacific update, but sometimes that is not enough, especially if you want to nurture the own individual Pacific Island countries and students and potential researchers from going forward. So I'm really appreciative of this, and I just want to keep that in mind, that the collaboration is important, especially when we look at what's happening in New Zealand, the New Zealand reset, the Australian step up. So these are all issues because they never understood the Pacific in the first instance. So now they've had to adjust because they realize they still don't understand the Pacific region. Naka.
Thank you. Michael?
Okay, first of all, thanks for the opportunity. I'm actually involved more with politics and political parties, but when I was given a chance, I thought I should take this chance to talk about something that's more important than political parties. I think what's important in the Pacific right now is climate change, in my opinion, because it's an existential threat. It's one of the islands, the first climate change related refugees would be from the Pacific and from Papua New Guinea, an island called Carteret. It's sinking and they're relocating the people to mainland. But the challenge is, and we've seen it this week, land, when you talk about land, land in the Pacific is always owned by someone else. And that's the challenge in Papua New Guinea right now. You are taking Papua New Guinea, people from Carteret Island, trying to put them or settle them in one piece of the land that's already owned. And conflicts around land, most of the conflicts in Melanesia, it's always related to land. So I think research in the Pacific should look more into climate change. And when research is conducted, the objective of the research, traditional objective, is that you research to add to academic knowledge or existing knowledge or fill in the gaps. But what's more important now is conducting research that the results can be used to help the participants that have been engaged in the research. That the research should have an impact, not only adding knowledge, academic knowledge, but it should have an impact. And I think that's important for research in the Pacific. Climate change should be an area that should draw much interest, and that the research should lead to contribution towards the participants. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. We'll take questions and comments after, but now I'd just like to ask the panel, what were some, I guess, key topics and themes that you think we're missing from the PIPSA conference this year? And I'll start with the men now. So Michael, you can go first.
Well, I looked at topics and attended most of them, and I think most of the topics cover the interest in the Pacific. Probably let the others talk about it. For me, I think we've covered most of it.
That'll be music to Kieran's ears. William?
Well, we didn't cover music. You did? Well, pop music. There you go, you covered everything. But on a serious note, this is my first conference, so I'm not. There's no measuring stick for me to say, what. So I can't really compare that to what previous conference I've been to. All I can say is that from having sat through nearly all of the presentations, it's amazing because one way or another you can relate. It's almost interchangeable with what one person is doing to what you're doing. So I would say that you covered a lot, and what you did not cover, I'm not entirely sure. But I really commend what's been covered so far for this conference.
Thank you. For me, I'm so glad to be here, because we can really talk freely in the academic forum on West Papua. It's hard to really talk on West Papua with a diverse perspective, but also the most important thing, because this is an academic forum. So without stigmatization, I think it's really important for me. I'm so grateful for that. But also, it strikes me very much when it comes to the topic of colonization, decolonizations, and that things. So maybe like me myself, I always really careful to use the word of colonizations because of my limitations myself to really understand this huge concept. But I really want to really use that on explaining what's happening, because I believe that colonization is the perfect concept that can be used to explain what's happening in West Papua. So perhaps like maybe for young scholars like me, we can really, if what is missing, I think like trying to dig in the concept of colonialism, especially not talking about not on just what they call a settler colonialism, like development and then colonialism. And I think the kind of concept is really important, especially for young scholars like me, so that we can really use that in West Papua, because like in West Papua, only 1 or 2 academic lecturers that can use that brave enough to use the word colonialism to explain what's happening. So we really need to understand and dig in more on that concept. That is for me. But after all, I mean, this is really good forum and to learn and then to connect. And maybe one more, maybe more like a Pacific scholar, like insider scholars from the what I like Kanaki, West Papuan insiders, and more like scholars that come from the indigenous scholars with the indigenous perspective. That will make more interesting, I think. Thank you.
Thank you.
I have about maybe 2 comments. Firstly, I think that having the conference here was a great opportunity for other Pacific Islanders, for us to see the Pacific from a different perspective, I guess. This is my first time in New Caledonia, so it's quite an experience. Secondly, I think the organizers did a great job, Karen, Lee, and Doctor. I had a friend message me, and she was asking me, oh, how did you get to attend the conference? And so that just got me thinking, maybe we could spread the word more about PIPSA. I feel like there are a lot of political scientists or scholars out there who would maybe contribute a lot of their research from different perspectives. But overall, I feel like from the sessions so far, there was so much covered, and a lot of knowledge sharing and getting to know what people are researching about in the Pacific. So,
thank you. Yeah. Okay, so I think just to kind of summarize just that last session, that I think from your perspective that we needed more women's political participation research and more women leaders. Also more research in terms of gender-based violence, and I think that was something that was highlighted yesterday in the keynote speech. Also Pacific regionalism and a dialogue, maybe a similar forum where young people can question leaders about if they can get their act together with climate change, why can't they for West Papua? Maybe Nick McClellan, once he gets accredited, can help with that aspect. Also looking at Pacific perspectives and climate change and migration policies. So the key thing too that I took from this panel was the need to collaborate more with Pacific Indigenous scholars, that any research that looks at the Pacific should be done with Pacific people in consultation with Pacific people and for Pacific people. So I appreciate those sentiments. And I also just took away from this conference the number of young Pacific scholars who were courageous enough to present their research for the very first time in this conference. So thank you to William. Also thank you to Jerry from USP also, who used this opportunity to present first. But most of all, I also just want to thank Melania Napa, because she's an undergraduate student, and it takes a lot to stand up in front of academics and present your ideas. So malo opito. So at that point, yes. Do we have any questions or comments from the audience?
Is a different. Okay. Thank you. So I just want to add a bit here with Bougainville, the representation, or it's something I see wasn't. There was no. I don't know if there was a paper, but yeah, there wasn't a representative or scholar that looks into that. So it's. I would love to see that, like in terms of with the theme, but as well as in terms of the one of the issues in the region that will be kind of like in the discussion is about the security, and with Bo Declaration and what the Pacific leaders are framing it and the language used about human security, whereas it's a different narrative. And so it is an issue that will be in the Pacific and with the geopolitics and interests of the regional players. So just wanted to add that.
Thanks, Ronnie. Jerry?
Thank you, Chair, for panel. And yes, thank you to ANU and UNC for hosting us as well. Thank you for accepting my paper. I thought I know the Pacific until this conference proved me wrong. Over the past 2 days, what captivated my attention was the acts of imperialism, colonialism, and oppression that is existing within the South Pacific. It's alarming. But what is more alarming, I would say, is that I fail to see any recommendations or way forward being discussed, and that's for me is shocking. So probably an issue to be discussed. This is not an emerging issue; it is an ongoing issue. So probably we can discuss more later on what's next, or what can we do about it, or are the proxy powers in Oceania interested in this subject? Thank you.
Thank you, Jerry. Can I just say that you are the solution, right? Like Pacific scholars, and just building on what Jack Corbett and Pat Weller and his team were talking about in terms of carving out a niche area to accentuate the smallness. Like we need to be carving out a space to accentuate Pacific perspectives. And this is what this conference and the theme and this panel is about providing that space for you, because you and you and you and you guys are the future, you're the solution, as Colin said. But we need the institutions to provide us with the time, the access and the resources to be able to do quality research that other people would like to hear, but also will, provide funding for. that's just my prerogative as a chair, putting that out there. Any other comments? Got one from down here.
Hi panel, thanks for an awesome discussion. I just had a question for G.J. Mealy. So what is the difference to you between Pacifica feminism and Caucasian feminism, if there's any?
Yeah, thank you very much for that that question. So obviously we can't, like for Pacific Island women and men who want to identify as feminists, like I do, feminism is obviously a Caucasian or Western kind of idea. But for Pacific Islanders, I feel like we could, we should always incorporate like our culture. We can't do away with it. Like women in Papua New Guinea, we can't say that, oh, the West has taught me to be independent and I can stand up for my right, but then our society doesn't understand that. They don't understand that, oh, women want to be free and they want to represent, they want to be represented in politics and in parliament. It's a very foreign idea. So we have to be smart in how we want to achieve equality. So it's something that I feel like women in the Pacific should come together more to talk about, so that we don't do away with our identity and say that, oh, like obviously if I'm a mom and if I'm married, I have my obligations traditionally, and we have the bride price system in Papua New Guinea. And if I'm saying, no, I don't want, because I feel like you're selling me and I'm not a commodity. And when I say that, I kind of doing away with part of what I identify as a Papua New Guinean woman. So how can I kind of embrace my culture as well as the Western ideals that say that we have to be equal in society? So I don't know if that kind of, if someone would have a comment.
That's big questions. Feminists. I mean, I believe that feminists are against all the patriarchal in every forms that it has in the state, in the man, even in the women, in everything. But I mean, for me, I'm a Pacific feminist as well, and for me, Pacific feminists always have a very particular context, and especially like in us in the Pacific, we're talking about the colonization, for instance. That is also a context when we're talking about the struggle of the feminists. We are like in West Papua as well, like our struggle not only on the domestic sphere, but our struggle as women also, we are against corporates, we are against state, we are against patriarchal in the harmful cultural practices, because culture can be seen as a comprehensive, cannot be seen as the problem of the women's, but only there are some harmful cultural practices that's our enemies. So I mean that there are very specific contexts for us, like as a feminist in the Pacific, that I mean all the feminists have their own struggles, but for me, the way I see that, we have a very very big struggle against all of this patriarchal in the corporation capitalism, and for me, like Pacific and especially like West Papua is like the best place to see how this global capitalisms and also like states and everything, they are just one place, and it's West Papua, and the women are the most affected by all of this. That's why we need feminism as a movement in West Papua. That's another story, but yeah, that's how I see Pacific feminists.
Question at the back.
Hi, I'm Lily Song from Otago University. I used to teach at USP. I have one comment and one question. I strongly agree with William that more Pacific voices need to be heard in any discussion about the Pacific. My question is for all young Pacific scholars in the panel. In the opening plenary, Colin talked about development in the Pacific. In my personal experience, I understand that people might have different definition of development and different idea of what is good development or sustainable development. So I want to know, in your view, what does development mean to you, and what development does the Pacific need in the future? Thank you.
Thank you. Who wants to go first?
It's a very tough question. For me, development is freeing an individual in whatever way you can, so that he's free to express himself. It's not really to do with infrastructure or stuff like that's important, but removing a constraint around an individual and creating that equal playing field, so that, and my philosophy is that who's lazy can die. Whoever is smart can take the opportunity and advance. So development should be removing legal constraints, economic constraints, anything that surrounds an individual, and giving him that freedom to pursue whatever dreams he has. I think that's more important than infrastructure and other things. Thank you.
I think when I was talking about collaboration or that, I don't mean in the strictest sense that every research that comes to the Pacific has to need a Pacific Islander, but I think in broader terms, when it comes to the serious questions or the West Papuan issue and all that, and so forth, there needs to be a greater discussion in regards to that. But the collaboration part, yes, that has to be the case. Especially because, and this is my experience, and I sometimes sit in meetings in the university and I find that I'm the only indigenous person in the room. And it's kind of ironic because, I'm from Fiji, yet I'm the only Fijian. When I say Fijian, indigenous Fijian, and I'm surrounded with all academics that are non-indigenous, and I'm by no means a nationalist. I'm no means by an activist by any way, but I just find it ironic that even though Fijians make up 60% of the population, we make up perhaps less than 20% in academics in the university, or maybe less than that. So I'm just saying that sometimes we fall through the cracks of not being inspired, or we don't see any role models to guide us in order to do better. So that's what I'm saying, whether it's within the Pacific region or whether it's externally. I just think that there needs to be a more driving factor in regards to that. In regards to development, I was talking to Chris earlier. Development, not so much infrastructure, and I agree with Michael, but things, the basics like communication. In the Fiji Parliament, we are not allowed to speak Fijian. And how can you communicate effectively or get a message across if you cannot speak in your mother tongue? So speaking English is already difficult as it is. So how are you going to communicate effectively? So we need to develop the simple things like communication, for example. I mean, that's my understanding of development. And from there, we build on the development of good governance. And then from there, all the infrastructure and that will take off after that, because you can have all the infrastructure and development, but if there's no accountability, that's just shoddy workmanship and so forth.
For me, I think the most important thing to be asked is development for who? That's the best question to ask. But of course, for us in our context, development has to be contextual, and because development is a very huge aspect for us. For the first thing, but by contextual, I mean like in West Papua, it has to be in line with the indigenous people's rights, of course, which means that all the development project has to be on consultation by free, prior, and informed consent of the indigenous people, which is not happening in West Papua because the government just have this national strategic plan construction, and they just do that without ask us. And that's why we are the victim of this development project. So it's not contextual. It's really what the top-down policy. That's not the development that we want. And the second one, in our context, what I can understand about the development has to engage the conflict and fragility context of West Papua, because like in our context in West Papua, we are not just fighting against the state, but we are fighting against the capitalism, against the corporation. Again, we also fighting with the non-indigenous and indigenous people among us, trying to find like opportunities. So this fragility context have to be engaged in the development planning. That's how we can really, that's how we can feel the development to us as an indigenous Papuan, but also as human. And the third thing, I think the factor that's also important is that all the development projects that violate human rights have to be stopped, because that's the most important thing. If the development violate our human rights, indigenous people rights, and then the question back, so for who the development is. Thank you.
I think everyone has basically said what I wanted to say as well. So I went on a scholarship by the US state government, and it really changed my perspective, gave me the opportunity to think outside the box. So I feel like what the government, especially the Australian government, has been doing, has been providing a lot of scholarships to develop the human resource of a country. So I think that's the way forward. So that we have more people who are thinking outside the box and not limited to their little communities or their villages, but they can have a more global outlook.
That was a great answer. All right, so I think we're going to wrap it up there because we have to get ready for the next session. So I'd just like to take this opportunity to thank PIPSA, and in particular the PIPSA President, Stephanie Lawson. I'd also like to thank our hosts, UNC, and in particular the organisers, Catherine Rees and Karen Baker, who put in a lot of effort to make this happen for all of you. All right, so can we thank them and also our amazing panellists?